Normally we'd take about a 15-minute kirtan break right now in between the two sessions. And as I said, the reason we're doing two sessions instead of one is because it makes them smaller on YouTube, and a person can watch one after the other in a succession. I can kind of hone in on just a very small piece of a particular idea, so it's easier to grasp. So now, this is our number 3, 0000, number 3, Basic Philosophy 101, Gita-From-Zero. This is the sport of philosophy. This is what question 4 was about, you know. And then we're going to talk about axioms and natural perspective of Bhagavad Gita, and then we'll do a quick coming attractions. We'll have music playing. No, we won't have music playing. So one of the things that I think is important to understand is that this is, of course, a Chandrasekhar crazy thing that boiled out of my own mind that I haven't read anywhere, and so you're free to reject it if you want. But this is my way of using a metaphor to kind of get across something that's harder to grasp than I think most people realize. Philosophy is kind of like sports, you know, like if you play soccer or cricket or football or basketball or anything like that, there's rules to sports, there's equipment to sports, there is a playing field, and these are very similar to philosophy in some ways. So you'll notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then down here we have also 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I guess you can see that. I have to think of a better way to do this in the future. I think maybe I'll put the screen at an angle to me so that I can get it out of my own vision and you all can see it. If the screen was there, probably that would be good. You all could see it, and then I wouldn't have to be right in front of it, and I wouldn't be dodging around the way I am today. But that's the way it goes. The cookie crumbles that way sometimes. So what sports equipment do we use? Now, if you're playing basketball, you've got a basketball and you've got tennis shoes, right? If you're going to be playing soccer, you're not going to have a basketball. You're going to have a different kind of ball, and you're going to have real good socks and probably shorts, and that's your main sports equipment. If you're playing football, you have to have all these big pads and all this other stuff. So, you know, that's a whole thing. So each kind of sport requires a different kind of sports equipment. And then we have referees, and we want to know, are the referees trained? These are the people who know what the rules are for, say, baseball or basketball or cricket or soccer or whatever it is. And they are able to see, well, that person did it wrong, or that person was out of bounds, or that person took too long, or this violated one of the rules. So we need to know who are the referees. And then each sporting type has a different kind of grid line. You know, like a baseball diamond looks very different from a soccer field. It looks very different from maybe a ice hockey field, where ice hockey you have to have ice, you know, where you're not going to have that in any of the other sports. So they're how big they are, what shape they are, and so this is the grid lines of the playing field. And then finally, we have to know what are the rules of the sport. Each sport has different rules. You know, you play baseball or soccer, or you're playing pool, or you're playing some other sport, you know. You have what are the rules, what you can do, what you can't do. And finally, we have favorite teams. You know, everybody, when they follow sports, they have their favorite teams. Now, how does this relate to philosophy? So we're saying then, what kind of sports equipment we use. So what are the starting fundamentals or axioms? We have to start with something with philosophy. Philosophy, you can't just pull things out of the air. If you're going to give an argument in philosophy, it assumes that you're going to be using certain ideas as groundwork or foundational principles. So that's the axioms, which are like the sports equipment, what we can use, what we can't use. And what the shape of the sports equipment is, how much of it we have, or in some cases we don't have much. Then referees. Then for philosophy is what do we accept as evidence, So if we are making a statement about a philosophical point, then what counts as evidence and what doesn't count as evidence? For some kinds of people, a certain thing would count as evidence, and other people would just reject it, that doesn't count as evidence for them. So that's kind of like the referees. And then where are the grid lines? What are the definitions of terms? This gets into what we spoke about a little bit a while ago, that language figures in. Because what do we mean by words? Words are slippery. And there are numbers of words, not just in English, not just in Sanskrit, but in all languages. There are words that mean different things. Like, for instance, I use the usual example of the word bank. If I just say the word bank, what am I talking about? Am I talking about one of those things where you go and put your money? Am I talking about one of those things where you go and you look at fishes in the water because you're on the bank? Or am I talking about when an airplane decides to take a left or right turn, it dips one wing down and the other wing goes up? That's also a bank, And, there's some words like the word run, which mean so many different things. It means like you're moving your legs very fast. That's one definition of run. Another is when you turn a water faucet on, it runs. When you have a fabric and it rips and makes a straight line, that's a run. So it's the same word, but it means different things. Sometimes there's a relationship between the words, but they're not the same word. So that's why our definitions of terms, and this is oftentimes why people argue and they can't come to any kind of common ground, because they're not even using the same meanings for the words that they're using. They've never done that. They've never stopped to define their terms. So if you're having a philosophical discussion with somebody, you can see if any of these things have slipped off the pavement into the ditch, So if we aren't agreeing on the terms we use, if we don't accept the same evidence, if we're not starting from the same things, then we're not really talking about the same thing. We're certainly not going to come to any common conclusion. So finally, what is our method of respectful dialogue? If you're going to have a philosophical conversation, does person A get a chance to speak, then person B gets a chance to speak? Is there some system for doing that? Can one person just speak forever? Can one person just shout the other one down? These are kinds of things that if they're happening, it's not a respectful dialogue and it's not really philosophy. And then, of course, as far as favorite teams, we all have our philosophers that we like and ones we don't like, and philosophical schools. And so in Vedic system too, we have what we call the parampara. The school, and of course for us it's Srila Prabhupada. He's the philosopher that's giving us an understanding of Vedic knowledge. All right, any questions about that? So I just basically tried to give an analogy between sports and philosophy, so that if we're talking about philosophy and the philosophy breaks down, this is the reasons why it breaks down, is the reason that we're not using the same fundamentals. We're not starting at the same place. We don't accept the same things to start with. We don't accept the same things as evidence. We don't have the same definitions for things, and that our respectful dialogue is not respectful anymore. And finally, we have our favorite teams. All right, so no questions. We'll move on to the next bit then. So what are axioms? Axioms are fundamentals. Maybe you've never thought about this, but to make any kind of presentation or argument in philosophy, you have to start with something. So say, for instance, I say that there is too much crime in America. I say something like that. And so you'll ask me, well, what's your proof of that? And I say, well, so-and-so gave a documented, analysis through some kind of, poll or some kind of, method that he used to find out. And I say, okay, well, how do I know he knows what he's talking about? Then you say, okay, well, he's got this credentials and he's done this kind of thing before and a lot of people accept him. Then I can say, well, how do I know those people accept him? Or, you can see where this goes, that you could just keep asking and asking and asking. You never get to anything. So no matter what you wanted to say philosophically, someone could always challenge it. And in some cases, it's correct to challenge these things. You want to have some evidence for it. But ultimately, we get to the point where some things, we can't prove them. Even in mathematics, there's the idea that a line is the shortest distance between 2 points. So it's a statement, but geometers have come to the conclusion there's no way to prove it, it's just accepted. And it seems fairly straightforward. Nobody's ever really argued with it much, so it's generally accepted. This is what we kind of mean by axioms. And when we ask for proof about everything, we can't establish anything. So even with the Greeks, they came to the realization that you can only examine things down to a certain level, down to axioms. So with geometry, there's, I think, 4 basic geometric axioms. I've forgotten what they are, but there are 4 basic axioms. You can build all of geometry from them, but you can't prove any one of them. And similarly, in modern philosophy, it's a similar kind of thing, that whatever you are speaking of, you have to start with certain basic fundamentals. And these fundamentals might be different depending on who is giving the philosophy and what they accept. So then what I've done here is a quick comparison between, for instance, Vedic philosophy and modern Western philosophy. These are all items, and in this case, these are all items where Vedic philosophy and Western philosophy directly contradict one another. And you can see that it's not possible to really prove one way or the other. Like the Vedic philosophy says there is a God, Western philosophy says there's no God. Vedic philosophy says he has energies and matter is one of his energies. Western philosophy says matter is all. There's no God, nothing besides matter. And of course, energy, so matter and energy, that's technically called physicalism. And that's modern Western kind of atheistic philosophy accepts that. Then 3 here, laws are subject to the lawmaker. For Western philosophy, there are only laws. There's no lawmaker. And therefore, the next thing that we get here is that, I'll jump over for right now. The rules of physics and logic are restrictions by God. And for the other point of view, rules of physics and logic are final, immutable, and universal. So this is what most Western philosophers and scientists accept, that we have the laws of physics, and they are final, immutable, and universal. If there was a God, he would have to answer to these laws. So, but they don't believe that there is one, so it doesn't matter. But these are two very different ways of looking at the world, and you can't prove either one of them, not to everybody. You know, we can certainly prove or give evidence to people who are willing to accept certain kinds of evidence, but that's where we get into the issue I was talking about before, that if you're not willing to accept certain kinds of evidence, then there's no argument that you can give, because people have already rejected the evidence. And that's why it's impossible to establish all these things. Now, there are places where Vedic philosophy and Western philosophy have the same idea about certain axioms, but these are the ones that they're very different, you know. The Vedic philosophy sees a top-down universe. There's God first, the most intelligent, most complex thing. Everything comes out of him. The Western materialistic philosophy is bottom up. We start with some kinds of primitive things, some kinds of matter, you know, protons and electrons and so on and so forth. They bump together and make more complex things eventually. Life bubbles out of it, et cetera, et cetera. Very different view of the world. We say karma exists. They reject karma existing. Karma is an important force. Karma is acting in the world. We talk about it all the time. Western philosophy doesn't acknowledge that it exists. We say soul exists. The Western philosophy, no soul exists. This is, maybe you've all heard of Occam's excluded, not Occam's razor, but the Aristotelian law of the excluded middle. So that things can either be or not be, but they can't both be and not be. But Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva is exactly that. Something is and isn't at the same time. So we say that the excluded middle sometimes does not hold, and they say the excluded middle always holds. And finally, we say there's a world beyond, but for them there's no world beyond. At least no spiritual world beyond. There may be another material world beyond this material world, but it's, there's no other world that is, non-material. So I just put this out there. There's much more to this than what I've outlined right here, but this gives you some idea of why certain kinds of people will not accept Vedic philosophy or even religious philosophy, because they hold all these things as being true, although there's no proof for any of these things. And we can't prove the other thing as well. We hold all these things to be true. Yes, what did you have?
Yeah, so when you say modern Western philosophy, is this like the belief systems that most people hold, or is it like the philosophers in the West these days, these are the conclusions they come to?
Well, this is, I would say, modern Western atheistic, scientismic philosophy, basically. Not every, if you went to your average person on the street, they wouldn't even know most of this stuff, But the philosophy that gets put across by academic circles, people in colleges and places like that, people who are talking heads of various, media, and who, especially those who are talking heads of scientism. I don't know, maybe you all have heard the word scientism. It's not the same as science. Scientism is kind of a almost religious faith in science, that science has all the answers and that anything else is not worth thinking about. So that's kind of, I'm just contrasting those two things. But most people, even though they may not have studied philosophy. Because we grow up in a school system, we grow up in a political system, we grow up in a system of media which gives us mostly again and again, reinforces these views and not these views. That's why people find the Vedic explanations hard to grasp and unbelievable, because they wonder, how can it be like that actually, if if these things are true. But the reason is because they believe these things to be true. But these things are not provable. You can't prove any of them. I just put them here. And this is why I wanted to, at the very beginning, kind of talk about this idea of a bedrock or foundation of axioms, because that's where we begin to talk philosophy. If you believe these things, certain kinds of philosophies are going to bubble out of it. If you believe those things, a very different group of philosophies are going to bubble out of it. All right. Any other questions about this? This is a lot to grasp, but don't worry about it. We're just touching it here. Later on, we will get into it a little bit more, and I'll start to show you how this ties into the larger picture of Bhagavad Gita. All right. So now we're getting into the many editions of Gita. We talked about that a minute ago, and so. There are many ways to explain Bhagavad Gita, and some may point the finger and say, well, why do you all believe that way? Or as Ellen was saying a minute ago, why do we believe that Prabhupada had the bottom line on it, or whatever it is? Those are fair questions. Those are actually fair questions. And we're going to explore that. Because as Prabhupada said, there are many perspectives to the Bhagavad Gita. And some may say, well, and this is kind of the way it would be presented in a college course, that, you can look at the Gita as a morality drama, or you can look at the Gita as an ancient system of laws. Or you could look at the Bhagavad Gita as an interesting drama from an ancient war epic. There's all these different ways you can look at it. And if we look at it in these different ways, we're definitely going to come away with a very different understanding. And that's why Prabhupada made this point that the Bhagavad Gita you should have the right spirit in explaining the Bhagavad Gita. He doesn't explain it in detail there, but later he does explain it, where he's talking about the Siddhanta, or the Gita has a theme that goes through it that ties it together. It's not just a collection of ideas. What's a good example of that? We might look at some ancient collection of music or writing, which is just a group, or probably the best example to use is a cookbook. You go to a cookbook and you've got all these recipes. Some of those recipes are sweets, some of them are savory, some are subjis, some are condiments, all this different kinds of stuff. What's the similar thing about them all? Well, they use some kind of food ingredients. But that's about it. There's not some theme that ties them all together. There might be some French cooking in there. There might be some Indian recipes. There might be some recipes from some other cultural background. But there's nothing that ties them together. Whereas in the Bhagavad Gita, it's not like that. The whole of Bhagavad Gita is like a three-dimensional puzzle that integrates and is self-consistent, or at least if the perspective is correct, it should be self-consistent. And therefore, people may point the finger at us that we're just being chauvinistic. We like our Gita because Prabhupada was a guy and he somehow or other, charmed our minds, and now we are sold out to him. So he's everything, everybody else is nothing. He's our man. But that's not what we mean here. That you can certainly make that accusation, but that's not what we're basing things on some kind of personality cult. But what we're basing things on is the fact that, as we'll see in a minute, I don't want to get into it, but in the next slide we'll talk about it, that there is a system behind why we accept what Prabhupada explained. So everybody, including the person who teaches Bhagavad Gita in an Indology class or comparative religion classes in a college, they have a perspective. That perspective may be that it's a bunch of different things, which is kind of syncretic perspective, which means that, it's a whole lot of things all at once. That's what they think. The yogis have their perspective on Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is a writing about yoga, which certainly 6th chapter does talk about yoga, no doubt about it. The Jnanis have their perspective, that we hear about jnana, which like the last 6 chapters of Bhagavad Gita do talk a lot about jnana. Karmis, they have their perspective on it. Certainly that's there too. 3rd chapter, 4th chapter to some extent, but mostly 3rd chapter and 5th chapter have a lot to do with the idea of karma. Now, I haven't told you yet about these different Vedic views, the yogi view, the jnani view, the karmi view, and the bhakta view. We'll discuss that at a later time, but we're just touching on it now. Then there's some people who just see this as a historical work, It was written 5,000 years ago. That's interesting. We're going to, in a little while, in a couple of sessions, talk about the Mahabharata, which it comes out of, where the Mahabharata comes from, how Bhagavad Gita figures into the Mahabharata. And but what Prabhupada is particularly objecting to is this number 10 here, using Gita for your philosophy. And this is mostly what these different many editions of Bhagavad Gita were all about. Somebody who had already a philosophy, and he used the Bhagavad Gita as the way to sell his philosophy. He pasted it over the words of Bhagavad Gita and made it appear to people who don't know nothing about nothing, people who, have never been in contact with Bhagavad Gita. He pasted it over in such a way that most people think, well, I guess that must be what Bhagavad Gita is about, And this is what Prabhupada particularly objected to, this, version of Bhagavad Gita where all we really learn is the philosophy of the person doing the translation. So, and this is certainly not a version of Bhagavad Gita that is useful. So let me see if there's any questions about that right now. And, well, I won't go here yet. That'll confuse you. What's wrong with my computer now? Okay. Any questions about that? Okay.
Maharaj, I'm just so curious because, the Bhagavad Gita, a few of us, I would think, knows that it was a conversation from Sri Krishna Bhagwan to Arjuna, which happened in a space of like 20 to 30 minutes.
Something like
and
that.
And then, this philosophy, which takes us years and years and even an entire lifetime to understand, even with utmost belief in the Gita, it's almost incredibly confusing at times to understand how Bhagwan could have related this philosophy for all of mankind within 20 minutes.
Right.
And say, okay, now you're ready to go fight the war.
Right.
Basically telling us, like, this is what it is, now you're ready to live your life according to this.
Right.
So my question is it actually for the benefit, we know it's for the benefit of mankind, or was it for, as you know, number 8 says, a historical part of what was going on just in the lives of the Pandavas and the Kauravas?
Well, it does obviously come out of the Mahabharata, of the whole historical epic of how the Pandavas came to be born, their preceding line, which is all in the Mahabharata. We don't hear about it in Bhagavad Gita. It's all Mahabharata. And then in the first chapter of Bhagavad Gita, we kind of have this morphing from the narrative of Mahabharata into the philosophical exposition of Bhagavad Gita. And then in chapter 18, we kind of get dropped back into the Mahabharata again. So the Bhagavad Gita itself is kind of a window of philosophy. Of course, there's big chunks of philosophy in other places in the Mahabharata, but nothing like the Bhagavad Gita. And what you have recognized is something that myself I've often struggled with too, and I understand what it must be like for new people. Bhagavad Gita is a very difficult book because Krishna touches many philosophical points that are very different, and he does so in a summary way, moving quickly from one to the next. And that's why it takes understanding Bhagavad Gita in the association of devotees to be able to put it into context. And we have other books like the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is, Bhagavad Gita is 700 verses, and we have the Srimad Bhagavatam, which is 18,000 verses, so it's much bigger. And in Srimad Bhagavatam, it discusses these things in much, much more detail. So because we know the two books are congruent and they're giving the same Siddhanta, then we can fill in the missing pieces and understand how and why Krishna segues from one thing to another. And in this way, that's why one needs to study a Bhagavad Gita under the authority of a bona fide spiritual master. So that's basically what you need. And so, again, Krishna moves very quickly through many subject matters. Once you're familiar with most of the subject matters, then you kind of are reminded of it, and it's kind of a quick cheat sheet that kind of takes you through things. But in the beginning, you have to get all the background and all the nuance and the stuff that Krishna doesn't say, but Prabhupada does say, and our past acharyas do say, to be able to fill in the gaps and to be able to put it all together. So that's a good realization, and that's actually one of the reasons why we're doing this, is to try to fill in the gaps. Other questions? Okay, we'll wrap it up here. So Prabhupada is calling his Bhagavad Gita as it is, and it's a natural perspective of the Bhagavad Gita. We say it's natural because the entire Gita is included. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for instance, just did the first 6 chapters as far as I can understand, He never got beyond chapter 6. And he said he would, but now he's no longer on the planet, so presumably he's not going to get around to doing the rest of it, at least in the ordinary way. This is telling that those who explain Bhagavad Gita in some way other than the way that Gita explains itself will have this problem, that there'll be parts of the Gita that don't seem to need to be there, and these other parts of the Gita seem confusing or pointless, so in some cases they just leave them out. One time I was doing book distribution in Chicago, Illinois, and I came back from being downtown Chicago on their subway system, and I went down I got off at a stop earlier than I usually do, and I realized there was a bookstore underneath the subway terminal, and I went in there, and I saw Bhagavad Gita as it was. And so, I've heard of Bhagavad Gita as it is, but now I realize there's a Bhagavad Gita as it was, So, at any rate, that version also didn't have all the chapters in it. And this is one of the things we can understand about the Gita. What does Krishna himself say about the Gita? And Krishna says, that in the 15th chapter, he says, that he is seated in everyone's heart. From him comes knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. And then he says, by all the Vedas am I to be known. Indeed, I am the compiler and the knower of Vedanta. So he's the person who created the Vedas, he's the person who knows the Vedas, and he's the person who actually is the purpose of the Vedas. So if somebody is claiming that they're explaining the Bhagavad Gita and they don't explain Krishna, then there's something suspicious about that. Because in the Bhagavad Gita, that's what Krishna is saying. So there is a simple flow to Bhagavad Gita if we actually have the natural or the as-it-is perspective. And we see that verses aren't given unnecessary metaphoric meanings. Sometimes people really stretch the verses in the Sanskrit to suggest something that you would never suspect from the verse. And this is suspicious. Sankaracharya did this, and others did this too. So this is also what gives us the recognition that we're talking about a natural perspective or an unnatural perspective. And then we find out that if you follow the process in Bhagavad Gita in a natural Vaishnava parampara description of it, you'll find a philosophy that actually works in your real life. I don't give you the same guarantee if you're following some other version of Bhagavad Gita. And it's self-consistent. It doesn't say one thing in one place and contradict it in another place. And it explains a plausible philosophy, a philosophy that we can believe because we see that it's speaking in common sense terms about the world we actually live in. And finally, this is the most important part, it's harmonious with ancient school of philosophers. So this is what we mean by parampara, Guru, Sadhu, and Shastra. That it isn't Prabhupada's interpretation. If we look at Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur's explanation, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur's explanation, Bhakti Vinod Thakur's explanation, Madhvacharya's explanation, these explanations are all the same. They concur with one another. So Madhvacharya was way long time ago, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was the spiritual master of Prabhupada. So there's huge amounts of time. And the basic Siddhanta means the harmonizing thread. There are things in the Vedic literatures which never change. And we can build off those things. They're like what we were talking about a minute ago, our axioms, the things that we put as the bedrock of what the Vedic system is telling us. And then when we see explanations or stories about those things or how we can put those things into practical use, then those things are based on these immutable things. And when we have a unnatural or a Bhagavad Gita as it isn't version, these things are violated. So we don't say Prabhupada was a magic man because he had a good way of talking or he had a good command of the English language. Rather, his explanation of the Bhagavad Gita is harmonious and congruent with the previous teachers. And this is where we get as it is. Okay. Now I'll take questions on that. I think we're, yeah. Any questions on that? So this is why we believe Prabhupada and we don't necessarily believe these others, not just because we like Prabhupada or because he was our guru or he was an old Indian man and we thought that that was cool. Of course, it was cool, but but anyway, that wasn't our reason, you know, so. All right, so I'm just going to go quickly through coming attractions and then we'll take the second test and we're done. So this is 125. We're going to talk about the history in Bhagavad Gita. Then 2.8, we're going to be missing one in between here because I have already scheduled to do a talk at the Bhakti Center. So there's a missing one in here.
Can we come to that talk? Maybe?
What's that?
Can we come to that talk?
Yeah, you can. It'll be at the Bhakti Center. It's about, they do a thing called Prabhupada Meditations, is what it's called, where people talk about experiences with Prabhupada or people talking about experiences others have had with Prabhupada. Then we're going to do a section on the Mahabharata, then one on Hinduism, and then different interpretations here. And then finally, we'll do a little bit about Western philosophy. So these are kind of the future segments we're going to be dealing with, and we will answer various types of questions like what is karma, how does reincarnation work, how do we reply to skeptics of materialism, what is religion, does free will exist, is there evil, why bad things happen to good people, who created God, how do we understand the all one, and the use of violence. Many of these themes are discussed in Bhagavad Gita, and this is why, you know, we will deal with them in an appropriate time, because there's a point in the Bhagavad Gita where these things will come up. All right, so any final questions before we take the test? Okay, so now I will upload the next batch of questions.